Greetings! Glad you've clicked on this link for another edition of Disaster Hack. The purpose of these videos is to provide some succinct information that's hopefully helpful for you to understand emergency management and homeland security. With that in mind, let's proceed. Today we'll discuss typical problems that will likely be encountered in a disaster. There are 1,000,001 that could be mentioned. I'll address some of those in other videos. But today we'll focus on communication, coordination, politics, transportation and logistics, and record keeping. As I mentioned, our goal today is to anticipate common challenges in disasters, find ways to prevent them before a disaster occurs, and then react quickly, effectively, and efficiently if we encounter them during or after a disaster. One of the most prevalent problems in any disaster is communication. In fact, almost every single after-action report after disaster reveals that there's communication problems or challenges. These can result from various reasons. For instance, the power lines could be destroyed or the cell towers could be down. Perhaps there's a lack of interoperability between the police and fire departments or multiple jurisdictions. There's a whole host of issues relating to information. Perhaps we have a lack of information. We don't know what's going on, how bad the disaster is, or what people are doing to respond and react. Perhaps there's excessive information. We have too many emails and too many calls. In addition, we could have dynamic information, meaning that the information is changing over time. On 9/11, in that particular disaster, there was a difficulty of knowing which version of maps were accurate. Also, another problem is sharing information in different languages. For instance, we often think we need to share information in Spanish, and that's certainly accurate. But in Los Angeles County, for example, it's estimated that there are 224 languages spoken. That presents some significant barriers. Also, we may share or fail to share information for other reasons. We don't know who to talk to or what information to relay. Fortunately, there are some steps that we can take to ensure effective communication in a disaster. I remember reading a report from Bill Swan, who's from the North Texas American Radio Relay League. He suggests that we don't get caught up in the excitement of a disaster. We need to take a deep breath and address every issue as they come up. Next, we need to remember that everyone's stressed, and so it's important to show respect towards others. Third, we need to make sure that the information we share is accurate. It's hard to retract incorrect information. Finally, it's important to keep our information or our communications short and simple. Remember, in this case, less is often more. In addition to communication problems, coordination is also a challenge in disasters. I really like this quote from Eric Aufderheide. He suggests, disasters may cross jurisdictional boundaries, create the need to undertake unfamiliar tasks, change the structure of responding organizations, and trigger the mobilization of participants that do not ordinarily respond to local emergency incidents. In other words, coordination is problematic because there's multiple parties involved. There's different SOPs and emergency operations plans at play. People need to adapt and adjust on the fly, and that's difficult. Sometimes we don't interact with different organizations like animal control or emergent groups and spontaneous volunteers. All of these issues make coordination problematic. There are some things that we can do to enhance coordination in a disaster. My own view is that we need to have contact, communication, and collaboration with others. In other words, we need to know who the participants are in a disaster situation. We need to be able to talk to them, and we need to have a willingness to work together to solve mutual disaster problems. But let me spend a little bit more time on the work of Thomas Drabek. This work comes from a report for the Natural Hazards Center in 2003. He suggests that we need to take into account different strategies to enhance coordination. First of all, in terms of core strategies, we need to clarify roles. Who is going to do what? Next, consequence strategies. We need to track needs, have a good list of what's needed and who is actually addressing those particular needs. Next, we can focus on the customer. We can serve others. Remember, our goal is to help victims and survivors. Another strategy deals with control. We can remind others of SOPs and emergency operations plans, or focus on the need to improvise based on the unique aspects of each disaster. Another strategy is to focus on culture, understanding the differences of organizations and remembering there's different ways of doing things, and then congratulating others and thanking them for their service. Politics is another issue which is witnessed in many disasters. For instance, people could exaggerate or downplay damages. For instance, one party may criticize the other for the impacts and the consequences. Or, in a developing nation, perhaps the losses are minimized in order to protect the economy or protect the tourism industry. But of course, those types of things can occur in the United States or elsewhere around the world. We need to recognize that. Perhaps there's conflict over priorities and approaches where one organization wants to be in charge and the others don't appreciate that fact. Perhaps there's difficulties when we interact with other organizations. Maybe police and fire are not getting along during the response, or perhaps the media is complicating the job of first responders as they get in the way of those involved in the incident command post or at the scene level. Another political issue is the placing of blame. We saw this frequently in Hurricane Katrina, where President Bush was criticized for reacting slowly to this particular event. In turn, he and his government criticized local and state leaders for not being prepared for what would logically occur, a hurricane along the Gulf Coast. Next, or another example is COVID-19. President Trump was criticized for downplaying the event and reacting slowly to it. In other cases, Fauci was criticized because of the changing recommendations that he provided regarding masks, for example. There are some things that we can do to reduce the political nature of disasters. First of all, we can get to know others. We can give them business cards before we meet in a disaster situation and get to know them in advance. We can shake hands so we don't have to point fingers later. In addition, we can resolve our differences and iron out details on who's going to respond and how when a disaster occurs. We can illustrate the merit of coordination, and that brings us back to Drabek's comments on consequences and customers. Next, we can seek support from key leaders, department heads or city council, the mayor, the governor. We can keep minutes on the decisions we make to protect ourselves, and we can also take advantage of focusing events. I really like the work of Tom Birkeland. He's a political scientist at North Carolina State University, and he suggests that disasters are a great time to implement change because there's a lot of attention being given to them after a disaster. Another challenge that we may encounter deals with legal problems. There's a potential for lawsuits after a disaster, and we've seen this in a variety of cases. For instance, in Mount St. Helens, the volcanic eruption that occurred in 1980, there was criticism over the evacuation zones. Many people felt that they were illogical and not safe. As a result, 64 people died, and there was lawsuits against Oregon and Washington and even the federal government. In 2012, in Italy, 6 scientists and 1 government official were sentenced to 6 years in prison because it was believed that they minimized the earthquake risk. That was overturned, but these examples illustrate that lawsuits are possible in and after disasters. There are several measures that we can and must undertake before a disaster or during a disaster to minimize legal problems. For instance, we can understand and follow constitutional law. We have to make sure that we're not discriminating against any of our employees or victims, and keep in mind that many governments or some governments have been sued because they have not addressed the needs of the disabled in shelters. Another idea is to follow specific emergency management and homeland security laws, whether it's the Code of Federal Regulations, the Superfund Amendments Act, or the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act. We need to avoid negligence. We need to make sure that we're acting in a way that illustrates that we're responsible or prudent as any normal person would. And then, of course, we need to practice what is known as litigation mitigation. Bill Nicholson suggests that we must work closely with attorneys to prevent any legal consequences relating to anything that we do in emergency management. Transportation and logistical problems are common in many disasters. For instance, transportation systems can be the source of a disaster. For example, aircrafts can be downed or trains can be attacked by terrorists. Ferries could sink, for instance. Also, transportation systems could be impacted by a disaster. For instance, roads and bridges could be damaged by earthquakes or floods. Transportation could be simply overwhelmed in a disaster. For instance, there could be too many cars trying to evacuate at the same time. Also, the receiving, storing, and distribution of resources could be problematic. There's a lot of equipment, a lot of supplies, donations, pallets and pallets of things that have to be shipped from one place to another, and this could be very difficult, if not impossible, in a disaster situation. Such transportation and logistical problems can be overcome, however. For instance, we can ensure there's adequate fuel in case of an evacuation. This was a problem during Hurricane Rita, and we need to avoid those types of mistakes. We also need to remove debris from roadways, whether it's trees or bricks. This will allow first responders and others to get where they need to go to help and assist those in need. We also need to make quick temporary repairs to roads, maybe patching holes and then fixing them more completely later on. We can set up barricades to keep people out of certain areas or establish alternate routes so people can get to where they need to go. And of course, detour signs may be needed. We need to keep in mind that we may need to be creative with transportation options. For instance, ferries were not identified in advance of 9/11, but they were very useful to get the people off of the island of Manhattan. Next, we could also hire people who are trained in logistics and use radio frequency ID tags to help us track the movement of resources, and we could also note those in WebEOC or other programs to help facilitate logistical measures. Record keeping is another difficulty that we might face in a disaster situation. I really like the work of Joe Scanlon here on this particular topic. He suggests that sometimes records don't exist before a disaster. Or he says that sometimes record keeping is difficult in a disaster because there's too much information flowing. Also, maybe our records are not accurate, or maybe they're not accessible by certain employees or people. Perhaps our records are lost or destroyed in a tornado, or hurricane, or fire, or flood. Or perhaps our physical records are toxic due to a hazardous material spill. In addition, our record keeping could fail in a disaster because this is just one of many functions that have to be performed. Now keep in mind this article is dated, and a lot of our records are electronic today, but we could lose our records if our power fails, if our internet is lost, or we lose our data in other ways. Joe Scanlon does provide some suggestions on how we can improve record keeping in a disaster. Obviously, we need to make sure it's a priority. And then next, we need to make sure that we determine what records are needed, how we could compile them, how we can store them, who can have access, and then of course all of this relates to the costs and benefits of record keeping. It can be very time consuming, but it's important nonetheless in and after a disaster. To wrap up, there's 1,000,001 challenges that may be witnessed or may occur in a disaster situation. I've covered just a few here. But it's very important that we plan in advance and that we make deliberate choices to overcome the challenges that I've mentioned. Thank you for joining me. If you would like further information, I would point you towards this book, which has a lot of information on disasters and the challenges that we might face and how to overcome them. Have a great day.